This is Chapter 2 of Wayside's Sideways Stories from Wayside School. And yesterday we heard about the mean Mrs. Gorf, who was a teacher there, but she's no longer there. Chapter 2, Mrs. Jules. Mrs. Jules had a terribly nice face. She stood at the bottom of Wayside School and looked up. She was supposed to teach class on the 30th story. The children on the 30th story were scared. They had never told anybody about what had happened to Mrs. Gorf. They hadn't had a teacher for 3 days. They were afraid of what their new teacher would be like. They had heard she was a terribly nice teacher. They never had a terribly nice teacher. They were terribly afraid of nice teachers. Mrs. Jules walked up the winding, creaking staircase to the 30th story. She was also afraid. She was afraid of the children. She had heard that they would be horribly cute children. She had never taught cute children. She was horribly afraid of cute children. She opened the door to the classroom. She was terribly nice. The children could tell just by looking at her. Mrs. Jules looked at the children. They were horribly cute. In fact, they were too cute to be children. "I don't believe it," said Mrs. Jules. "It's a room full of monkeys." The children looked at each other. They didn't see any monkeys. "Oh, this is ridiculous," said Mrs. Jules. "Just ridiculous. I walked all the way up 30 flights of stairs for nothing but a class of monkeys. What do they think I am? I'm a teacher, not a zookeeper." The children looked at her. They didn't know what to say. Todd scratched his head. "Oh, I'm sorry," said Mrs. Jules. "Please don't get me wrong. I have nothing against monkeys. It is just that I was expecting children. I like monkeys, I really do. Why, I'm sure we can play all kind of monkey games." "What are you talking about?" asked Todd. Mrs. Jules nearly fell off her chair. "Well, what do you know? A talking monkey. Tomorrow I'll bring you a banana." "My name is Todd," said Todd. The children were flabbergasted. They all raised their hands. "I'm sorry," said Mrs. Jules, "but I don't have enough bananas for all of you. I didn't expect this. Next week I'll bring a whole bushel." "I don't want a banana," said Calvin. "I'm not a monkey." "Would you like a peanut?" said Mrs. Jules. "I think I might have a bag of peanuts in my purse. Wait a second. Yes, here it is." "Thanks," said Calvin. Calvin did like peanuts. Allison stood up. "I'm not a monkey," she said. "I'm a girl. My name is Allison, and so is everybody else." Mrs. Jules was shocked. "Do you mean to tell me that every monkey here is named Allison?" "No," said Jenny. "She means we are all children. My name is Jenny." "No," said Mrs. Jules. "You are much too cute to be children." Jason raised his hand. "Yes," said Mrs. Jules, "a chimpanzee with a red shirt." "My name is Jason," said Jason, "and I'm not a chimpanzee." "Well, you're too small to be a gorilla," said Mrs. Jules. "I'm a boy," said Jason. "You're not a monkey?" asked Mrs. Jules. "No," said Jason. "And the rest of the class, they're not monkeys either?" asked Mrs. Jules. "No," said Allison. "That's what we've been trying to tell you." "Are you sure?" asked Mrs. Jules. "We'd know if they were monkeys, wouldn't we?" asked Calvin. "I don't know," said Mrs. Jules. "Do monkeys know that they are monkeys?" "I don't know," said Allison. "I'm not a monkey." No, I suppose you're not. Okay, in that case, we have a lot of work to do. Reading, writing, subtraction, addition, spelling. Everybody take out a piece of paper. We will have a test now. Jason tapped Todd on the shoulder. He said, "Do you want to know something? I liked it better when she thought we were monkeys." "I know," said Todd. "I guess now it means she won't bring me a banana." "There will be no talking in this class," said Mrs. Jules, and she wrote Todd's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Chapter 3, Joe. Joe had curly hair, but he didn't know how much hair he had. He couldn't count that high. In fact, he couldn't count at all. When all of the other children went to recess, Mrs. Jules told Joe to wait inside. "Joe," she said, "how much hair do you have?" Joe shrugged his shoulders. "A lot," he answered. "But how much, Joe?" asked Mrs. Jules. "Enough to cover my head," Joe answered. Joe, you are going to have to learn how to count, said Mrs. Jewls. But Mrs. Jewls, I already know how to count, said Joe. Let me go to recess. First, count to 10, said Mrs. Jewls. Joe counted to 10. 6, 8, 12, 1, 5, 2, 7, 11, 3, 10. No, Joe, that is wrong, said Mrs. Jewls. No, it isn't. I counted until I got to 10. But you were wrong, said Mrs. Jewls. I'll prove it to you. She put 5 pencils on his desk. How many pencils do we have, Joe? Joe counted the pencils. 4, 6, 1, 9, 5. There are 5 pencils, Mrs. Jewls. That's wrong, said Mrs. Jewls. Well, how many pencils are there? Asked Joe. 5, said Mrs. Jewls. Well, that's what I said Joe. May I go to recess now? No, said Mrs. Jewls. You got the right answer, but you counted the wrong way. You were just lucky. So she put 8 potatoes on his desk. How many potatoes, Joe? Joe counted the potatoes. 7, 5, 3, 1, 2, 4, 6, 8. There are 8 potatoes, Mrs. Jewls. No, there are 8, said Mrs. Jewls. But that's what I said Joe. May I go to recess now? No, you got the right answer, but you counted the wrong way again. She put 3 books on his desk. Count the books, Joe. Joe counted the books. 1,000, 1,000,000, 3. 3, Mrs. Jewls. Correct, said Mrs. Jewls. May I go to recess now? Asked Joe. No, said Mrs. Jewls. May I have a potato? Asked Joe. No, listen to me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, said Mrs. Jewls. Now you say it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, said Joe. Very good, said Mrs. Jewls. She put 6 erasers on the desk. Now count the erasers, Joe, just the way I showed you. Joe counted the erasers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There are 10, Mrs. Jewls. No, said Mrs. Jewls. Didn't I count right? Asked Joe. Yes, you counted right, but you got the wrong answer, said Mrs. Jewls. Well, that doesn't make any sense, said Joe. When I count the wrong way, I get the right answer. And when I count the right, I get the wrong answer. Mrs. Jewls hit her head against the wall 5 times. How many times did I hit my head against the wall? She asked. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You hit your head against the wall 10 times, said Joe. No, said Mrs. Jewls. 4, 6, 1, 9, 5. You hit your head 5 times, said Joe. Sorry. Mrs. Jewls shook her head and said, Yes, that is right. The bell rang and all the other children came back from recess. The fresh air had made them very excited and they were laughing and shouting. Oh, darn, said Joe. I missed recess. Hey, Joe, where were you? You missed a great game of kickball. I kicked a home run, said Todd. What's wrong with you, Joe? Asked Joy. Nothing, said Joe. Mrs. Jewls was just trying to teach me to count. Joy laughed. You mean you don't know how to count? Counting is easy, said Marisha. Not now, said Mrs. Jewls. What's easy for you may not be easy for Joe. What's easy for Joe may not be easy for you. Nothing's easy for Joe, said Marisha. He's stupid. I bet I can beat you up, said Joe. Try it, said Marisha. That will be enough of that, said Mrs. Jewls, and she wrote Marisha's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Joe put his head on his desk between the 8 potatoes and the 6 erasers. Don't feel bad, Joe, said Mrs. Jewls. I don't get it, said Joe. I'll never learn how to count. Sure you will, Joe, said Mrs. Jewls. One day it will just come to you. You'll wake up one morning and suddenly you'll be able to count. Joe asked if all I have to do is wake up. What am I going to school for? School just speeds things up, said Mrs. Jewls. Without school, it might take you another 70 years before you wake up and are able to count. By that time, I'll have no hair left on top of my head to count, said Joe. Exactly, said Mrs. Jewls. That is why you go to school. When Joe woke up the next day, he knew how to count. He had 55,006 hairs on his head. They were all curly. And that's the end of that chapter. See you tomorrow.